Hello, and welcome to Talking with Machines.
Something
I'm
about
Mark
the
Corbett Wilson, a
way
lifelong learner, artist, and retired high-tech glassblower. I spent 2 decades working in Surveillance Valley, making gas lasers, X-ray tubes, and high-intensity lamps used in the manufacture of computer chips. Now, I'm a critical digital humanist, the learning technologian at the Western Institute for Social Research in Berkeley, California, and a digital storytelling facilitator with StoryCenter.org. In sum, I'm a working class educator in third spaces who helps people glean meaning from experiences and tell their stories. Today, I'm joined by Bryan Alexander, Tom Haymes, and Ruben Puentedura. Friends, please introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'm Bryan Alexander, Senior Scholar at Georgetown University. I'm a futurist specializing in the future of higher education.
And I'm Tom Haymes. I'm a founder of Idea Spaces, a startup software company in the AI sense, and also consultant, teacher, photographer, and jack of all trades.
And I'm Ruben Puentedura, and I'm independent education researcher. I work on how do you get technology to actually make a difference in education. In that context, I've developed several models. SAMR model is probably the best known of the lot. And these days, I also find myself working a lot in the context of different types of unexpected events like black swans and so on, as well as, you might guess, a lot of work on in terms of how do you use the new branches of AI, particularly large language models, in education, and also how to make them make a difference and explore new things you couldn't explore before.
So, we invited you today, Ruben, to tell us a little bit about your work, especially around RAGs, RAGs. We've been talking about other models and what we've been experimenting with, both inside and outside the institutions. And someone mentioned that you've been doing a lot of work with RAGs. I can't remember if it was Bryan or Tom. So, if you could let us know what you're working on these days.
Sure. So I don't know how much you've already discussed RAGs, but again, for people who may not know the acronym, it's an acronym for Retrieval Augmented Generation. And it basically says, okay, I have an LLM, no matter whether you're using one of the commercial ones or one of the open source ones. And then I need to get some more stuff on the table. And we'll come back to some of the reasons you might want to get different additions to the knowledge base. And when you add to the knowledge base in a way that isn't just something you typed into the prompt, you start to get into the domain of what are called RAGs. Now, there's a lot of jokes about the acronym was first slapped on the idea, and nobody ever thought about, well, now we're going to be stuck with this acronym forever and ever, but there it is. So that's it. And I've been doing a lot of work in it in terms of education, in terms of saying, okay, so how do you use a large language model engine, whether it's ChatGPT or, really things like Claude or the Google Gemini family, whichever one it is. How do you use it in a way that's not passive? How do you use it not just as say, okay, I'm going to ask it a question, it gives me an answer, and then I say, thank you, ChatGPT, or whatever it is, but really to use it to explore areas of knowledge and so on. So a lot of my work on RAGs has been in that sense, not just in terms of how do I add to the knowledge base, although there's definitely that, but also how do I use a RAG as an exploration tool? And one of the nice things is a lot of tools have come on the landscape. So when I started using rags so long ago, all of maybe 3 years ago, not even that probably, it was a question of okay, so cobble your own thing together with a little bit of Scotch tape here, a bit of Python there, and hope the whole thing held together long enough to run the test. These days, it's much, much easier, and Google has really made getting into RAGs, at least at a basic level, much, much easier with the tool set of Notebook LM, which is really just that. It's a basic RAG. It's a very simple RAG, but it gets you, some really interesting capabilities even at that basic level. So that's the type of thing that I've been working on. I want this to be a monologue, so maybe I want to hear from you guys. What are you guys interested in with RAGs, and what you can do with them, and I'll be happy to share what I've done, what's worked, the things that have crashed horribly on me. And I mean horribly. You should see some of the crashes I've seen. What are you interested in?
So, I mean, I think I'm probably the Notebook LM aficionado in this group, in that I probably have done I have been playing with it a lot over the last 2 or 3 months. I'm on the verge of hopefully going to the pro version, and we'll see what that does to my capabilities. But even on the basic version, I'm able to put together, you know, curated databases or curated source lists for various things, including workshops and things like that. There's some real limitations in terms of the way it operates and they're silly things like getting users into it and of course the limitations on sources and things like that. And as I discovered earlier this week, and we talked about in our chat, trying to connect my RAG content with a larger GPT content doesn't work and from either side. I wanted to. I have, as a political scientist, I, for instance, have a database of some of my, what I consider my seminal uh, works about how constructivism works. For instance, that's kind of the approach that I take to political science, and I have those loaded into a RAG, and I can do fun things with that. But if I ask, it's like, okay, look at the things the Trump administration has done over the last month, and based on these readings, what should I be paying closest attention to? And it wouldn't do it. And I couldn't do it from either the Gemini side to access my RAG, although it seemed to imply that perhaps it would work in a workspace account. I do not know if that's true because it made me sign, but I don't have a functioning workspace account anymore. And it would not work at all with from the inside of Notebook LM. It would not query, even though it's using Gemini as its model. I don't know if the Pro version fixes any of this, but to me, that seems like a really interesting thing to be able to do it, to connect to say, okay, this is the tome that I want you to, the framework I want you to be thinking in. This is the brain. This is your grad school readings. Now, taking your grad school brain, what do you see that I'm missing in the world today, or whatever area you're talking about? I mean, I'm talking about politics because, again, I'm a political scientist by training, but I can see a bunch of different applications for that in terms of, engineering, basic engineering texts, and what should I be looking for based on this accident report, what's likely to pop up and that sort of thing, looking through this filter as opposed to that much broader, uncontrollable filter that you get with a GPT. So that's one thing I've been running up against, but I have had a lot of fun trying to get it to basically create my own curated database of information where I can be pulling stuff out. It's been really handy for finding quotes. If I need a quick, oh, where did I read that kind of problem? And that, as I get older, that becomes a much bigger problem. I heard a really good quote this week actually from Jeff Jarvis. He said, "Human beings are not set up for memorization. We're set up for processing. That's what our brains do. And memorization has always had to be something we've had to arduously learn and practice." And I think there's some logic to that, and therefore, to what extent can we get uh, the AI systems to become our memorization side, where we can focus on the processing side, things like that. I think there's a lot of interesting possibilities there. I haven't really had a chance to use Notebook yet as a teacher, um, but I'm seriously contemplating how to do that. Unfortunately, it breaks one of my assignments. I figured out exactly how to spoof my assignment because I use an open source textbook. You upload that in a Notebook LM, and you can basically get it to write any assignment that you have coming out of the textbook, which says to me, what should I be doing in terms of, is this really an effective assignment in an AI world, especially? But how do I do this in such a way to achieve similar goals to where I get the students to hash with it without just using it to do their work for them? And that's a constant refrain in terms of all the AIs. Replacement versus augmentation is an ongoing issue for all of my classes, and so we will see. But that's kind of where I am coming in terms of my RAG world. What about you, Bryan?
Kind of want Ruben to take a response to
Sure.
that, if
Yeah,
possible.
sure.
Sure, absolutely. So that's a great set of uses for it. Let me tell you a few things that might relate to that. So let's take a step back again. I don't know how familiar your audience is with, what's going on in an LLM. The first thing I would say to people is when you're talking about what a large language model is doing, as soon as you start saying something like it's reasoning, it's thinking, I say, no, stop right now. It's not reasoning. It's not thinking. You are thinking, you are reasoning, you're using a certain type of pattern generation, matching, etc. of the LLM through different interfaces, one of which is chat-like, so it mimics some of the interactions you have, etc. But there is no internal thinking going on. That's important here. Why? Because there is no way for no matter which one it is, doesn't matter if it's Claude, ChatGPT, or so on. And like I say, I really should be careful. It's really not so much the interface that people see through ChatGPT is not the engine behind ChatGPT. So it's 4.0 or O3, O3 Mini, whichever one it is you're using for it. That's really what we're talking about. The interface you see is a chat interface that runs on top of a large language model. So, but it's not thinking. So if you say, hey, let me throw everything at the kitchen and the kitchen sink at it and tell me what's interesting or important about it, it doesn't work. Why? Because it doesn't think. If I go to research a new topic, one of the first things I do is I do a deep dive. Typically I'll do this in stages. Let me actually describe the way I really do it, not just a, high level, whatever. The way I first do it is I say, okay, I need a couple of intro texts here. Sometimes it's a textbook, sometimes it's a short essay, sometimes it's a review article, depends on the area. But I need something to just give me a sort of lay of the land. And this is usually Tom or Bryan or Marco, when I'll go to one of you and say, hey, listen, I'm interested in this change during the Meiji Dynasty in Japan. I know you know about this. Can you tell me one good starting point for this? And I start there, right? And then from that, I make my summaries, index cards, I extract stuff. And yes, I can use an LLM if the book happens to be in digital form, or I can put it in digital form, of course. So I can help me with that process. So I can extract summaries and so on. And that helps. It's a very basic form of RAG, but I can do that. Okay. So I upload that up. Okay. Extract that. And then I say, okay, so here are the key points. And now I go to a heavier duty database, like say Google Scholar, and I use those as key terms to help me pull out. And I typically will get a ton of papers. I'll get at least 50 papers or so, but then I winnow it down. And I winnow it down to maybe 20% of the total. And I do use engineers know the 80-20 rule. Everybody knows it, not just engineers. So 20% of the materials have 80% of your content. Is one way to look at it here. So I winnow it down there. Okay, that's the process that right now no RAG can do for you, no LLM can do for you. There are people working on it. I'm one of the, if you ask me some things I'm working on, can I automate aspects of this? Yes, but it's very tricky and we're not even close to it, okay? O3 with all of its touted capabilities just has a tiny little fraction of what you need to be able to automate this. So what I do instead is I say, okay, I'll do the legwork, but I'll let the RAG help me out by saying, okay, what can I do? Well, I can load things into the RAG, like Notebook LM. So for instance, I can load that book that you told me, hey, that's the first one to go to, Ruben. Really start there and say, okay, give me a summary of this. Give me an outline showing me the major points. That I can do. I can also say from this, I can even query, especially if I have one of the higher level engines like O3, for instance, I can even say, are there points in this book that appear to be poorly justified? If so, what are they? I can even do that because, especially if it's a new subject to me and I'm saying, wow, this is something about the life of the emperors. Is this true? I've never heard this. Maybe I'm missing something, and maybe you can say, well, based upon the rest of what's in this LLM, here are some things you can look at, or no, this is not justified. What you'd be well advised to look into this. So I can do that sort of thing. And then I can use that. And again, what can I do? Well, I can not yet with Notebook LM, although I see this coming. But I can automate this when I write my own to say, automate this query and pull the big database. And then for the big database, ask the questions that I would ask normally to say which ones of these are that I can automate. And then I go in and I pick, I say, okay, keep this one, this one, this one, and only those make it into the LLM. So to your point, Tom, if I'm building out this, I can do it right now, but I can't just do it by dump everything in there. It has to be selective. I find that one notebook per topic is max what I can do. I have several my own homegrown LLMs, the ones that are, as I say, some Scotch tape, Python, and so on. In some cases, I have several that come together on a topic because even a single topic is too much for it. But definitely, try to concentrate to one topic and to go through this process. Say, what's a key source? Start with that, and then add sources to it. And that's how I find I can build it out. So it is important because the temptation is to say, well, if I put everything in there, it'll pick out the right stuff. It has no idea, none, how to pick that out. There is nothing in an LLM, not one iota of a thing that can do that. What it can do is it can say better matches, worse matches to these patterns, and you leverage that through the chat interface. But that's nowhere near enough to do the type of more deep, sophisticated thing that I know you do as a researcher whenever you're researching a topic. So it's a great assistant. It's a great tool. But let's also be clear on the limitations at this point. It is by no means an automated system. And this comes to another topic, but again, I'd like to hear more from Bryan. But just to introduce it a little bit, you mentioned about using it for teaching, that you haven't used it much for teaching.
Yeah, I have a follow-on question to that, but Bryan, go ahead.
But just to clarify a little bit, so one of the interests for me in teaching is not so much to give the students, here is my own mini textbook assembled from all this stuff. I'm interested in students using it to do the type of explorations that I just described.
Yes, that's exactly.
And then the next generation. And I'll come back to that later. But Bryan, I'm curious to hear from you.
No, I'm going in a completely different direction. So I would totally mess with the flow. Tom,
well, I had one simple question that I wanted to ask, and it's not a simple question, but we are all experienced researchers. We have been through graduate school. We have spent our lives researching problems. We know all of the pratfalls, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying you are an experienced researcher, Mark, too. You just because you've been more informally trained, that's still. But the point is, we don't compare to our students, or certainly not my community college, undergraduate, or high school students in terms of their ability to do this. And of course, the problem they do is they don't want to bother with it, and they want to replace that, right? As opposed to doing the work themselves, but learning those skills. How do we get them to do that? How do we structure things? And yes, for my ideas, yes, I want to build a database and get them to query it and then come up with the other thing as far as reading is concerned, those of us who have been teaching in college for a while recognize that 80-20 rule is awfully generous in terms of how much the students actually read that you assign to them, or much less the amount, whatever you may have lectured to them, if that's what you still do. And so my challenge, I look at it as an opportunity actually, is to get them to engage with the material without having to read it, which of course most of my colleagues think is a cop-out. But what are you going to do, right? Let's be realistic here. But how do you get around that?
Yeah, for me, it's a question of focus on doing. In other words, one of the things, but this is, it's an old problem, Tom.
Yeah.
I always joke that it'd be nice when people say, well, couldn't academia use LLMs better? I'd say, let's start with couldn't academia use libraries better? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm, I mean, Bryan, and the rest of the group, we were all talking about the fact that you're doing work with librarians and so on. Librarians are an amazing resource, and I've always used them no matter where I'm at. For me, I always used to teach my students saying, hey, here is an important phone number. Okay, this is from the era of phones. I went, with the dial, a real dial, not even a touchtone. That's how far back all this goes. I said, here's the reference desk phone number. Okay, and I used to give them, among others, the New York Public Library, etc. I say, this is one of the most valuable things you have, because these are human beings who have been around knowledge and around thinking about how to use knowledge for so long that there's stuff in their brains that you have no idea how it got there, but man, can you use it. And what we needed to do, I've always insisted, is we need to make better use of all of that in academia. We need to use better use of what's inside people's brains. I mean, Mark, you were a glassblower, right? Think of all the stuff you could tell me about glass blowing. And I was actually very lucky. I learned how to blow many, many moons ago. I used to do lab research, and I learned how to make vacuum lines, okay? And I was trained by somebody, but it wasn't just, okay, and now we use the blowtorch here. There were things about the material, how the material interacts. There's all that knowledge about the world that's in your head because of what your hands did with the material. That then if I'm saying, hey, I have a student who's going to be a lab researcher, how do I get that out? I don't want this to be memorizing step one. Take blowtorch. Step two, turn it on. Don't blow yourself up. Step three, whoops, you missed step two. Oh dear, that's a problem. So, etc. Right? There's a whole series of things. So, to your question, Tom, and why I went on this sort of tangent, is because that's what we need to do to get our students to use this. We need to give them the sort of things where they say, I don't know how to do this, and none of the books tell me stuff. Exactly. Figure out how to extract the knowledge that's in the book that encompasses this huge range of all that's in the world that people summarize, compiled into books in different ways and so on. And you need to compile your own and then figure out how to use it. So I keep coming back to less and less, even whatever is appropriate. There is a certain knowledge retrieval that's important to doing things. So again, to the glass blowing example, if you don't remember how to, turn on that torch, you're going to have problems if you have to look it up each and every time. So there is some knowledge retrieval, but there has to be a reason for the knowledge retrieval. And too often what we find is we just tell students, here's your exam, memorize chapters 10 through 15, whatever, and I'll give you an exam, it's retrieval. That's the easy bit. That's not even challenging. And of course, students rebel against it because they have a perfectly good question, which is, so why the hell am I doing this retrieval? I know I don't want to blow myself up. There's a good reason for remembering how I turn on the system, but I don't necessarily know this. So to your point, Tom, what I try to do and what I think about whenever I'm constructing Notebook LM is how do I use it to give students a difficult question, a challenging question, one for which I don't know the answer. They don't know the answer, but it matters for some reason. So for instance, one of the topics I'm working on, precisely because of your point about, so we've all had our time in academia, we love academia, etc., but not everybody has had, how do you get some of the knowledge about how to process knowledge in there? That's one of the things I've been working on using Notebook LM4, looking at different areas like logic, like different types of subsets, really not the whole thing of scientific thinking and so on, and say, okay, how do you use resources to help students understand how this works, but then use it not just because, isn't it interesting what Popper had to say, for instance, about falsification? Say, no, here's a problem that's bugging you today, now. And I'm going to give you a seed of the problem so you're not just searching in space, because that's my responsibility as a professor. But there's a problem that you are going to have to figure out how the hell to apply Popper's falsification approach and the thinking and all this other stuff in there. And you know what? There isn't a single book that tells you this because Popper died years ago. He wasn't looking at these problems, but you are. And this matters to you. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you the tool. I'm going to prime it so that you're not starting from scratch. But then you are going to have to build out. You're going to have to figure out what type of text go here. And guess what? The LLM ain't going to do it for you because it can't. At this stage, it can't. But you know what? You can do things that you couldn't do without the LLM, without the RAG. And that's the payoff. And that's where you show the student, hey, I get it. Now, doesn't mean the student may like the topic, may not like the approach. There's no guarantees here. Okay, let's be clear. And then, every student gets it. Nah. But it gives you the opportunity, it gives them the opportunity. Just like whenever I told them about the research, to get back to where I started with the phone number for the research librarian, right, and the reference desk, I always gave them, okay, but why would you do this? And let's do something with it that you don't know, I don't know, but we can all figure out together if we use this resource. And that's the type of thing I'm looking at. And again, I'll be honest with you, it's early stages. Notebook LM couldn't do half of the stuff I was asking it to do just 6 months ago. Okay, when I went, I think the second day it was available as a beta test for limited audience. I got access to the early beta. I crashed that thing. We want to talk about crashing hard. Okay, I tried some of the open textbook stuff to say, what can I construct? Ooh, nice. I typed in a query. Boom, the whole thing exploded on me. Wait, what happened? I just lost 1 hour's worth of work of uploading text. That's what happened. And other horrific, crashes with things that wouldn't go away. I couldn't even delete, etc. All sorts of horrific stuff. But that was X months ago. Now, it's a tool that I can use for this. And it's an evolving tool.
Do you have the pro version?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
because
and some of what you're describing is solved in the pro version. This is something probably your audience is not terribly interested in because it will probably change next week anyway. Uh, but uh, but let me
yeah, it
know
seems
off,
like
and we'll
some of
take it
these.
offline. I'll go over what sort of
Yeah,
the restrictions you're running into.
it seems like some of these issues could be solved with access to the
Yes,
bleeding edge Gemini that you get
yeah.
with the pro version as well. So yeah,
Yes, yes,
okay.
and I'll definitely tell you it's definitely improved. I don't have I just started looking at some of the new stuff,
Hmm.
so I don't know the full details of what's already been switched over to the latest versions of 2, what not, and what still is on research versions, but it's definitely improved. No question about it. As I say, some of what you described, some of the frustrations, yeah, I've been there, and some of that is solved, not everything, but
Yeah, if I can
some
just
is.
get my Google account stuff straight, I could get to the pro version. My problem is that, in short, is my wife is the manager for our thing. I want to pay for this out of my business credit card because it's a business expense. There's no way to pay for part of it in one and part of it in the other. And so, but I did find out that I can at least use just the Google One stuff and separate that out from all the other Google stuff we pay for and let her pay for that and I'll just pay for Google One and that solves the problem, I think. But we're still laboring through how to get that to work. Google needs this is something Google's notoriously bad at and has been for a very long time is this account management from people who have multiple trying to connect a Google Workspace account to a personal account has been a long running easily theoretically to me at least easily solvable problem. Maybe they should ask their AI to fix it for them, but
So
Next
before
generation.
before Bryan veers us off in a new direction that I'm looking forward to seeing, I
yes.
have to say, so my Western Institute for Social Research, from now on, WISER, is a Google Workspace institution, and the Google Workspace for Education, even though we have the Plus, is slow to get these things. But I have my own personal account, and so I got access to the new Notebook LM. So the first thing I did was try to break it. So I dumped 300, and now the limit is 300 documents. So I dumped 300 documents into it, and it didn't break. Um, and so the ones I selected, one of my interests, more than an interest, is ePortfolios. So I had more than 300 documents around ePortfolios for lifelong learners, so specifically in adult education.
Did you
And I dumped those in.
did you dump your AI list into it? How many I forgot how many sources that is, that Google Doc with the massive AI bibliography?
Yeah, no,
I
that's
don't know how
that's
many
like
that is.
600. Yeah.
Oh,
No, I
okay.
so but already I've learned something today, and thank you for that, Ruben, because that's not the right approach. And right away, so I just started summaries and lists, and the results were, mediocre at best. So now I won't waste any more time on that. So thank you for that. Um, and maybe later we'll talk maybe a little more technically about how these rags are built because Gemini is built on Anthropic's Claude, and then Notebook LM is integrated with Gemini, but I'm not clear how. But I want us to veer off in a new direction before we run out of time here. So, Bryan, what is it you want to talk about today?
Well, I was going to talk about the business model for rags. How do we make money with it? In fact, one could say, how do we go from rags to riches?
Ugh.
Oh, you realize
Oh,
the okay,
But but
congratulations. It's now Friday. You've definitely won the,
Hey, I did it
fun of
first.
the
I wrote it
week.
in the chat. That's mine. That stinker is mine.
I didn't even see that yet. Oh, there you go, Tom. I should have known I was with the pun master. But no, the question I wanted to ask was about truth. Um, Ruben, the people have been talking about using RAG technology in order to better improve the truth output of generative AI, specifically to reduce hallucinations. And I'm curious, I mean, first of all, how does that work? And and how is it working? What do you think of it?
Uh, that's a great question. So the first thing I tell people is if your main goal is you're seeing a lot of hallucinations, tell me what you're seeing as a hallucination because for unfortunately many types, RAGs won't solve your problem. And it's a question of what is triggering the hallucination. Okay, the truth is the term hallucination is used so broadly that it's almost meaningless. So there are several things. So for instance, one example is you say, well, the AI just doesn't know something that it should know. So it just kind of halts at some point it shouldn't halt because it doesn't know something. That's not a hallucination. That's just a lack of something in the knowledge database. And that you can solve with RAGs. And there's a second type of hallucination, which is what I would call the domain specific hallucination. And it's what happens when you ask a RAG and it doesn't have, when you, sorry, an LLM, and the training in a particular area is kind of weak in that area, in as much as it doesn't have much in the way of terms of art and so on. It doesn't have enough of a framework. So it goes off into the weeds, right? So suppose this actually doesn't happen with the current version of Claude or OpenAI, but it did used to happen with older versions. If you asked it about some concepts in education research and you asked it about constructivism versus constructionism, it was not the database that it was drawing from was not rich enough to really differentiate clearly between concepts. And it would instead pick up other areas that have used those terms or similar ones and try to merge the whole thing. And you wound up with a mishmash that sure went off into the weeds and so on. So that type of thing you can solve with RAGs by augmenting the knowledge database. So it has the necessary knowledge. As I said, okay, then I'll stick to this. No need to go into the weeds with the other stuff. And it doesn't make up stuff like that. And finally, you have a whole series of things that have to do with fragmentary elements in the database. So for instance, things like references. Frequently hallucinations, it says, well, it hallucinated this paper that didn't exist. I say, look at the paper a little more closely. That paper didn't exist, but maybe one of the authors wrote another paper on the topic, or the title is similar. So it's picking up. It's like your friend who's a little fuzzy after one drink too many at the bar, and is trying to recall that, yeah, was it Jones or James, something like that. And they're right. There was a paper written on the topic of lizards of the tropics by James, but he remembered Jones. So you go looking for Jones and you say, hey, Jones, no Jones papers. But if you do a little bit of searching around the title, he seemed to remember, oh, but there is a paper by James. LLMs, because of fragmentary aspects, because not everything that went into training the LLM is there, cannot be. There's always only a subset that survives in the patterns and so on. We'll tend to do that. So all of these things can be enhanced. And the other thing has nothing to do with hallucinations, which is to bring knowledge to the table that simply wasn't available or foregrounded and foregrounded. And that's not hallucinations. That's just saying, back again, what matters to what I'm trying to research. So all of that you can fix. There are types of hallucinations, however, that you cannot fix. If your LLM was poorly trained in part of its training, and I've seen major LLMs have holes that you could drive a truck through, that you cannot fix with it. Because what happens is the connections, the patterns just go off in wild directions no matter what you do. And it can even get worse sometimes with RAG, if that's the case. Because it says, you just gave me something great. Now let me take this thing that's completely unrelated, and now I'm really sure that I've got it right. And it doesn't think of that. Okay, it's really a pattern gets reinforced that shouldn't get reinforced. It's really what's happening. I critique of myself. I shouldn't speak of that. It's a reinforcer of a bad pattern. And it also can't fix elements along the lines of saying, aside from things like poorly trained or poorly specified areas of LLMs, it also can't fix things along the lines of saying, well, what settings are you using on this? Most people just use the defaults, and not all of the language engines allow you to adjust the chat. But there's a couple of settings. For instance, temperature can be viewed as the higher you set the temperature, the more it explores. But there's a problem. Set it too high and it's jumping all over the place. It's like your friend who's now had way too many drinks at the bar, but for some reason, instead of getting sleepy, they've gotten excited. So now they're going, yeah, you asked me about Antarctica and penguins. And did I tell you about the San Diego Zoo? Anyhow, I have a friend who lives in San Diego, and you should see by the ocean. But I was asking you about Antarctica, not penguins, not your friend in San Diego, not San Diego. That's what happens if you turn the temperature too high. Turn the temperature too low, though, and you can get not enough exploration. So it just gets into this pattern that gets you nowhere near where you want it to go, but that's where it's stuck because the temperature is too low. And there are a few other patterns like that, and you need to adjust those, particularly if you're tweaking your own system. And again, RAGs will not help you with those settings at all. In other words, in fact, what you'll have to do sometimes is if you have a temperature that worked well without the rag, you're going to have to adjust the temperature and a few other patterns to get the things optimally for the rag. ChatGPT, so the OpenAI team, the team at Google with Gemini, tried to tweak things so they cover 90% of the cases. In my experience, that's optimistic. They tend to fail pretty badly as soon as you start pushing them in more than half of them and so on. But if you go behind the scenes and you can tweak this by getting access to a developer settings, you can fix a lot of this. But again, RAG itself will not fix that for you. You have to know what you're doing with the settings to fix those things. So that's, I think, long answer to your question, Bryan, but that's where that helps and doesn't help in terms of some of what people are trying to fix from the big LLMs using RAG.
I
And
on I on the other hand want hallucinations. I want those weird connections. I want
okay,
to perceive information in a non-standard way, as a way of going, huh, I never thought about that before. I didn't realize I didn't see that connection, right? And I find actually a little frustration. I think Notebook LM is a little bit, let's say, unimaginative in some ways when it comes to this. I did something a couple weeks ago where I basically loaded um, my Discovering Digital Humanities book, and I think it was Academia Next, into
Wow.
Notebook LM, and I said, "What do these two books have in common? Where are the points of commonality on it?" And it found a few things, but I didn't think I thought it was pretty predictable in that sense, and trying to get it to come up with weird synergies because I like to load up my notebooks with books that seemingly don't have anything to do with each other and try to get it to form associations because then I can explore that as a way of perceiving things in a different way.
So,
As I think I may have said before, to me, the difference between a boring photograph and an interesting photograph is almost always one of perspective. You know, if you shoot everything from eye level and things like that, you're going to get the same boring pictures that everybody else does. But if you get low and you look at things in a different way and you go, wow, I didn't ever see a vase that looked like that, that is interesting as a photograph. And I encourage my students to do that in my photography classes. It's hard to get them to do that, to be honest. But I want to be able to do that with ideas in a way that, and I do that with ideas manually, but I'd like the AI to push me in a direction where it knocks me out of my comfort zone and I start to think about things in a different way. And I depend on talking to brilliant people like the three of you to do that. But I'd also like a plastic pal that's fun to be with. So,
so I have two recommendations. One is, especially as someone with German as you do, is to crack open Hesse's Glass Bead game, um,
mhm.
which is entirely about that.
no.
But then and if when you start reading it, let me know because I'd be happy to reread it along with you. Because the whole center of that book is about making those weird connections. The second is it sounds like you want your AI to microdose, and I think
Yeah.
now we may have found a business model to get from rag to riches. Um, but on the other hand, though, Tom, I'm completely sympathetic with you. I mean, I love doing this kind of work. In terms of finding weird connections, I'm a huge fan of surrealism, and so I love generative AI hallucinations. They don't fill me with dread. But I think I inhabit the uncanny valley as a native. But I have to recognize that for a great number of people and different uses to different degrees of legitimacy, the hallucination problem is a serious one.
Mhm.
If you have people trying to get to do math, then there are still, math limitations. If you're trying to get to do precision in a wide range of sciences and engineering, again, ditto. It's a serious problem. But it's also a cultural problem. I mean, this freaks people out. Almost
Yeah.
every anti-AI account I read, uh, not only they'll refer to hallucination or use other words, but they'll emphasize, these ideas that most generative AI output is bad, which I think is incorrect, but they keep running with that. So there's this
Mhm.
idea, how do you correct this? And RAG has been put forward as a technology which can really help with this. It sounds like from your excellent description, Ruben, that it sounds like for some purposes and for some users, and in some frameworks, this can actually be beneficial.
Mhm.
Um, Yeah, it's going to take a bit of tweaking, a bit of running. But I guess I have a more practical question than my usual questions are, which is how does a newbie get started with deploying RAG? Is this something which any of the commercial providers like Gemini or Perplexity just have available? Is this something which you have to install as a plugin from one of those, or is I know the answer to this last one is going to be, or should you just get an open source LLM and then find an open source RAG and plug them together and run?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I have my love of open source, and I would say that's really where you can explore, most readily. And this is a place where things have changed from the Scotch tape days, as I say, not that long ago. But let me just say for commercial providers, there's only one right now that does a true RAG without having to invest a lot of additional money and resources and time, and that's NotebookLM. NotebookLM is a true RAG. And it's, Google is doing a good job. Basically, I have to say the Gemini engine has improved. The notebook interface has improved. The whole thing has improved over time to the point where it started from going, it was just a nice toy at the beginning to now being a rather useful tool. So if you just want to get started and you want to start with something, even the free version, even though it has, as Tom pointed out correctly, several non-trivial limitations, is already worth exploring. But let's say you actually want to explore and really start sinking your teeth into what uh, RAG can do. There's a nice little open source tool called Anything LM, and you can either get it for free and install it on your machine locally. It runs on Windows, Mac, or Linux. Doesn't matter what you're running. It does need a computer. Right now, there's no version yet that you can run solely on a tablet or phone, but that may change. At least I'm hoping it does. Either way, though, if you have any computer, pretty much you can run it. And the nice thing about anything LM is it's the whole package because it allows you to just install one thing and then it says, okay, let's take this piece by piece. What do you want to do with your language model? Do you want to use one of the commercial ones? If so, just enter here your key. If not, do you want me to use one of the open source ones? Great, just tell me which one. And obviously, you want to pick one that fits your machine size. I recommend having at least 8 gigs to 16 gigs of RAM to do it. That is a limitation. If you have a machine with under, you can go as low as 6 gigs, but much less than that, and you're in trouble. Simply because the size of the models, even the smallest models that can do, there are what are called, there are specific edge cases for things like if I put something I want to act as an LLM on a Raspberry Pi to recognize pedestrians in front of my bicycle. That's a very specialized case. But if you're doing RAG, those types usually don't work very well. So I do recommend having somewhere at least 6, but preferably 8 to 16 gigs of RAM. The more, the merrier. And they'll say, great, with this RAM, you can install these and you can pick one that you want to install. You have it locally, and it says, wonderful. Next thing, we're going to need to store somewhere your documents and so on. Do you want me to create a database, or is the commercial database out there you want to use? You want to create one? Wonderful. Here it is, done for you. And finally, it says, great. I want to start with the RAG process, and it gives you a basic tutorial, and you're off to the races with things that are Notebook LM like. But then you can do more complex things. So for instance, one of the things, let me give you one example that, again, it's a first order example. And the latest version of NotebookLM can do a version of this, but not the older ones, or not reliably at least. And as I started out, I say, okay, so here are some materials. I put in some basic materials and I ask some questions, okay? So say I'm interested in education research, I'm interested in Vygotsky, and I put in some basic material about Vygotsky and say, tell me about these aspects. And because I'm interested in digging, and it goes into that, uses the RAG material sources, and it says, okay, so this is what I can tell you about this. And I say, wonderful. Now I want to dig into that deeper. And because of some other searches I've done, I add some more materials now along those lines. And I keep on going with my conversation as though nothing had happened. And then I ask more questions related to this. And here's the interesting thing. Instead of getting bogged down in too much stuff and going off into the weeds, it says, okay, I guess these must have been there, but, I don't really, but okay, it'll keep on the conversation, the pattern, the responses, incorporating the new RAG materials. I'll keep on doing that as long as you like. So this is a way to gradually increment the number of materials and also see when, whoops, I added this and suddenly things went into the weeds. Roll it back because you can roll back the pattern. Go back to where we were here, take these out, let's try something else. So it gives you an exploratory incremental RAG that really is, again, for that type of exercise that I was talking about earlier with students that Tom was interested in and so on. You can do a lot of very good exploratory work. Say, is this a good question to ask? Is this a better question? What materials will help me with this question? So there's a lot of exploratory work you can do that. Now, as I say, the latest version of Notebook LM sort of does that. I've run into some issues when I try to push it too hard. It works better with the open source ones, but nonetheless, you can do it. And then beyond that, one of the nice things about anything LM is that it has a built-in engine that allows you to do things like some automation and so on. And some of it just came out 2 days ago. So I haven't even had a chance to try it myself. I just installed the new version, started going through a tutorial. This stuff I used to have to write Python for, but now you can do it with a simple, much simpler, okay, step by step, what do you want to do next? You can do things like start to include things like branching, go to resources, do a search, pull back from the search and use search results and so on. Lots of interesting stuff that, again, you can do some simplified semblance of that with Notebook LM, but really, once you start getting deeper into this, you really would want to go with the open source. So that's my recommendation. And then beyond that, listen, if you know a little Python or can use an LLM to help you code Python, the sky's the limit. And there's all sorts of really interesting projects. So let me mention one that I like a lot. For instance, there's a lot of work being done on graph uh, rags. And graph rags basically say, can we use the structure among the semantic entities in what I'm researching to inform the process? So say the example everybody uses because Microsoft published a paper on it is Dickens. And I use things like, is the son off? Is the father off? Is the employer off? You get the picture, right? And it turns out you can do some amazing stuff if you build your RAG using these semantic relationships to inform the process. Amazing work to be done there, but it's a lot of work. I'll be honest with you. One of the reasons you see a lot of people say yes, and here's the example. It's of, they were doing Dickens. Now you're doing the Bronte sisters. What's going on here? And the answer is, well, because they already did the hard work of creating the semantic model that allows you to do the heavy lifting on, novels from the Victorian era, etc. And so there is that. But there's a lot of promise, and some new tools have appeared literally just in the last 2 weeks, for instance, that may help with how to use LLMs to get at some of those semantic relationships more easily so that you can build this out. But as I say, now you're getting into coding domain, and while LLMs have made coding easier, you still have to do the logical flow aspect, even if the LLM helps you with the Python itself, etc. So but as I say, so to your point, Notebook LM, excellent point to start in the commercial. Anything LM, a great point to start in the uh, open source. And I know as you typed into the chat, I assume when this podcast gets posted, you can post some links. So anythingllm.com is the right address.
So I'd like to ask you about, take this in a bit of a different direction. I work with mostly older academics who are basically technophobic, as a basic stance. And so, I'm that one-eyed teacher in the land of the blind. And I always, first of all, point out Harry Frankfurt's on bullshit. I don't use hallucination. I just point out that I think it was Danny Inney, the marketer, that said that these large language models are moderately competent, hardworking assistants. They'll work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but you have to check everything they do. You can't trust the output, and so you've gone over that, Ruben. But outside of North America, there's another conversation going on about how limited the training models are. Our friend, I assume everybody knows Mahabali, has been talking now for more than a year about how pathetic these models are when looked at from her point of view, from her culture in Cairo, Egypt. And I hear similar things across Asia in these conversations in higher education. I can point myself, as you pointed out, Ruben, there's a lot of implicit knowledge in glassblowing. I've always been proud that I've shaken the hand of people who have shaken the hand of people that goes back 2 millennia, none of which has been written down. And so my entire career, my entire focus of my life until 2008, to put a date on it, is missing from the training models. And so this now I'm hoping the RAGs help improve that, but I would like you to talk a bit more about, and especially since you mentioned open source, I'd like you to talk a bit more about the basic layer, the computational layer at the bottom, and how it was trained. And I'm very suspicious when I hear people say open source in relation to large language models because of the size and complexity and the backward and forward propagation. How can we audit a model? How can we be sure that a model is open source? How do we know that a model is open source? And how do we, in any way, assess the training data? So it's a kind of a critical question.
It's a great question. And the answer to your question is right now, those of us in the open source world live in a very imperfect world. So sometimes we'll be given access to everything. We're told, here's the entire training data. Here's all the weights that resulted from it. Here's the whole process. And we can even see the logs of the process. But that tends to be for some of the smaller ones. For the really big ones, like the biggest llama models, and so on. Sorry, we're given the weights, but we have parts of the process. We have parts of the training set, but we don't have the complete data set. And in other cases, we don't even have that much. So, for instance, for the commercial ones, obviously outside the world of open source, by many cases, we don't even, we're told just trust us. And it's a very good question. I would much rather have access to the whole thing. Now, we do have some auditing tools that allow us to do things like, for instance, what can we do? Well, if we know the entire corpus that was used to train it, we know something about what might or might not be in there in terms of things that should be there but are not, or too much of one stuff that might be outweighing something. And there are tools that we can use to weigh that statistically. There are tools that we can use to look in the raw materials, and I'll come back to this in just a second, to see how concepts are related to each other. So some of Maha's questions can be addressed by this type of tool where I can say, well, show me where this concept is that I'm going to argue works differently in, say, Egypt than it does in the US, than it does in China, than it does in the EU, etc. Right? And show me where it is in relation to others, and let's see what it's connected to, and is it connected enough or not enough. There are tools for auditing this type of thing, and we can do that, but we need access to information. We need access to the full weights. If I don't have access to all the weights, I can't necessarily do this. And it's important to realize that there's levels of training. So you have kind of the raw thing that you pull together into a first order pattern. And that's where a lot of this stuff becomes crucial, because any type of refinement you do on that, if it's not in the base, it ain't gonna be in the refinement either. And in some cases, once again, can you fix this with RAG? Only if you have enough patterns in the base that will enable you to leverage the additional patterns in the RAG. If they're not there, ain't gonna work. Uh, so this is one of those places where the more we can push towards getting the information and the tools for visualization of things like, where are concept clusters is really fascinating. I remember the first time I saw one of these visualizations, working on the modern, we've known about this type of visualization, of course, for decades. If you worked in AI before large language models and so on. I remember the first time I saw it, and it was at a conference where an NVIDIA presenter was presenting this. And my immediate question into the chat, because I was online, unfortunately, I couldn't be physically there. Otherwise, I would have stepped on stage right there and said, give me the code. I want this code now. And I typed into the chat, immediately say, where's the code? Where do I get the code for this? Because it was such an amazing thing. And now, of course, that's much more commonly available and so on. And you can use that to audit. But again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We need more transparency in sources. We need more transparency in the weights. We need more transparency as to the process. And there's something else that people say, well, why do I care? If it's done, it's done itself. No, listen, I can show you. If you show me, for instance, how the model is being trained, there are certain parameters I can measure about the model that show me, is the model being trained correctly or not? And this came up, for instance, in the context of Llama, in one of the versions where Meta said, you know what, it's not training well. And from everything I heard, they were right. It wasn't training well, but it would have been very useful for them to say, and here we're going to release the model that's not working, but we're going to show you why we know it's not working and how it's not working and how we know that the training just went off the rails completely. I've heard rumors that things like that have happened at OpenAI, but that's not publicly available. And we could all learn so very much from that. So that's another aspect of the open source that to me is important. Share with me how the training went and also share with me the failures because we're at the stage right now where we learn a lot from the failures. Just there was a toy model that was released about a year ago. It was terrible, absolutely terrible. But poking at it because I had access to more of the parameters that went into it, I could say, oh, this is what went wrong with it. This is why it starts spitting, the same thing, the same phrase over and over again. It goes into this wild loop because it overemphasized this type of pattern in the training set I see, and this is how you can avoid that, etc. So to your point, Mark, you're absolutely right. Do we have a perfect, true open source? Like, say, I have true open source for every level of Linux, except for the graphics drivers, because there suddenly we start getting into commercial issues and so on. Uh, I wish we did, but for the most part, we have fragments, portions of it. One of the things about recent events in terms of, with R1 open source coming much more broadly in the context of LLMs into public consciousness is there's more pressure on companies to release more of the training set, more of the weights, more of the process. And I'm hopeful that we can get more of that. The other thing is, I'll be also honest with you, as we understand more how to do this, it gets more and more feasible for a group to go from the ground up and say, you know what, we're going to train from scratch. And there have been a few attempts at that, the Red Pajamas group and others like that. But we still have a ways to go before we can match something like, say, the best Llama model, for instance, in open source, or the best Mistral models in open source.
So for now, I think I'm going to stick with the statement I try to start my presentations on large language models. I'm with Kate Crossford. AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. So I try to, I see you do, Ruben, is stick to LLM to be more specific. But
And I call it augmented intelligence.
yeah,
I think
well,
that's a
that's
much more
more a Doug
accurate.
Engelbart guy. But I state
Somebody
in
has to.
my trainings, because we're using, again, Google Workspace particularly, and of course, commercial models more generally, I, I, I'm going to stick with the statement that there is no ethical use of AI, period, because we just don't know. And so what I promote, Tom, if you'll just let me finish my sentence, um, I promote that we need to think about responsible use. And that also brings up, back to the cultural bias. I mean, to me, all data is biased inherently. And so there's that. I mean, that's a huge issue that we can't even get into here. So what do you think about that statement, Ruben, that there is no truly ethical use of AI, but we need to think about using it responsibly?
Definitely under responsibly, we'd have to get into a discussion of what we mean by using it ethically. In other words, I'm willing to accept for at least some projects, not for all, I'm not going to lie to you. For some projects, I'm willing to accept the word of some of the researchers involved that say, look, I can guarantee at least this much about it, particularly when I have auditing tools, etc., for it. So I'm not going to go quite as far as say there's no, but I will agree that you have to say caution because, as I say, just because somebody says, I've seen projects labeled as open AI, and I'm going to say, you're not charging me for this. That's true. But other than that, you haven't given me the weights, you haven't given me the training, you haven't given me the source, you haven't given me anything. It's just, same thing as the Chat GPT people, except that they're at least honest and they say, no, we're not going to give it to you. And, we're just going to charge you. You're just not charging me. and but you're not being any more open about it. So again, I would love to see more of a push to open. I think those of us in the open source community that use this to the varying degrees it's possible right now to call it open are pushing more towards, hey guys, we really want a more Linux-like situation here than what we have right now. Uh, but in the meantime, I would say caution. I'm not, as I say, so I'm not going quite as far as you are, but I do agree that it's not as simple as saying, well, if it has a little open source tag on it, it's good. So hold on, we still need to evaluate a bit.
And I
And I'll
would say
also, yeah, go
I
ahead,
would
sir.
say the biggest problem with the stuff with the idea of an ethical AI or non-ethical AI comes from the idea that somehow we should be looking to it for answers, and that is part of that technological transition that I think we're really struggling with. As I put in the comments earlier, you can trace a direct line from how people used libraries, card catalogs, to the internet, to Google, to LLMs, but that doesn't mean that's the right, we still haven't made that second technological shift that Bryan likes to talk about into thinking about how it changes our task set. We still use it like it's a library and a card catalog. And in that, yes, you have ethical problems. What do you include in that collection? You could have an unethical library that only has the works of Marx and Lenin in it or something like that, right? And or I'm sure that some people would question the collections of the North Korean university in Pyongyang or something like that, and under those in terms of what it includes and excludes. But the again, I think of AI as a completely different thing in that it helps us think about things in a different way, and I think that's inherently ethical because we get unethical when we assume our perspective is the only this perspective, and that someone should be telling us what to do. And I think that is a fundamental flaw in how we approach information and thinking in general. And anybody who's got a good critical thinking skills knows to question that. And unfortunately, the vast majority of people have lousy critical thinking skills. Um, and that's a whole other conversation as well. So I think it kind of misses the point in the sense that if you have to argue about its ethics, you should question the ethics of anything. I question the ethics of most of the books I read. What are you trying to convince me of here, right?
Bryan, as we come to the end of the hour, you've been active in the chat. Anything you want to add here?
I want to thank Ruben for his wonderful, thoughtful seminar answers to my impertinent questions. Um, I was going to add, I mean, we've been talking in many ways at the personal level of, what software to run and what machines to use. And I do wonder about the strategic level, to what extent an enterprise, be it a university, a company, a nonprofit, a government office, can use RAGs. And I also wonder about them at a kind of national or even civilizational level. What would is this something, the conference, the ill-fated conference at Paris last week, should that have concluded with urging all participants to run RAGs, as opposed to running ragged? Is this something that China should be advocating for its incredibly energetic AI sector? Is this something either that the US federal government should push? It seems very pro AI, or a RAG something that AI critics, such as Mark, should be advocating for as a way of ameliorating challenges and problems of generative AI? That's not a comment, that's a giant question, and I don't know if we have time for it.
Oh, we have time, but just, I wanted to move us towards an ending. But that's a great question. I'd like to hear Ruben's thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, Bryan, as you know, I was at the conference virtually again and not physically. And yes, absolutely. If it was such a missed opportunity, frankly, because a lot of the discussion was, frankly, not looking at what could we look at in terms of creating resources, opening up the gates, if you will, for new avenues. What you could do in terms of saying, hey, the cost for any one entity, even a well-funded one like Google uh, or Anthropic or whoever, uh, is huge. What if we started looking at a true open approach? You know, and again, no reason you can't have both, right? So Anthropic can continue doing its thing, OpenAI can do its thing, but we also have a kind of internationally sponsored approach to saying, hey, can we generate a training set? Can we generate the procedures? Can we make everything as open as possible? Uh, and not just make it one big international, but also encourage different regional approaches, different, so we can see, because some of the questions we have are open questions. And this is, Mark, going back for a second to some of what Maha has pointed out. I don't know the answer to some of those. So linguists don't know the answer to some of those questions as to how deeply embedded are some differences across languages, how many of them are actually more superficial. We don't know. But man, is it a great opportunity to find out. And I was really sorry that, frankly, very little went in that direction. A lot was about, well, we'll make sure that we have an engine for our national blah 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 for whichever, whether it was the EU or India or whoever. And there's nothing. I understand that, sure, but there's much more that could be done here. So, to your point, Bryan, yes, I think an extension of the RAG approach, both to encourage people to use RAGs, to encourage entities, etc., but to also encourage the building out of greater capabilities that allow you to better leverage and better construct things, including, we haven't even gotten into retraining models for specific uses and so on. And that's a whole other cup of tea that we could get into, etc. So I think that I would very much, frankly, if you ask me, would I love to see the different entities, worldwide that could be involved in this try this, including multiple approaches, many of which, by the way, I know will fail. So it's also a question of, I don't expect all of these to be incredibly successful. If I did, we probably wouldn't be doing the research. We'd just be taking it straight to production and that's it. But that's what you need. You need these different approaches. You need these different things, and because of the scale, you do need more than just, well, write the small grant and you'll get that and stuff. It needs to be a bit bigger. So I think there's an opportunity here, whether it's rags to riches, I don't know. But from my perspective, it is the opportunity to really build out some amazing tools that we just don't have yet, because we don't have the knowledge or the scope to build them yet.
We're still trying to build cars around engines and or aircraft around engines. I'm very fascinated with early aviation stuff and this combination of the engine and the aerodynamics that people were sort of figuring it out, often fatally. Uh, but speaking of advertising your failures, auguring in a plane is kind of, is a good way to advertise your failures. But I think we're kind of in that phase with AI. And to me, Notebook LM and the RAGs are a good first step at putting some body work on the engines that are language models. And to me, that's most interesting because most people don't give a crap about the engine. They just want a car that will get them to where they want to go. And I certainly get frustrated with tech I have to mess with too much. I want to do creative things with it, you know. So. And on that might be a good ending point. I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
Well, I would ask Ruben if he had fun today and if he had any final thoughts, and then we'll jump on out.
I had a great time. As always, it's wonderful talking with all of you. And I think, for final thoughts, it's an exciting time. And my encouragement, since all of us work in different ways with people, in learning in different contexts, including academia and so on, is to encourage people to experiment. That would
Mhm.
be, what I keep coming back to. Play with it, have fun with it. Not everything has to be deeply serious for, the most serious thing in the world. I sometimes have a lot of fun just trying absolutely silly topics that have absolutely no socially redeeming value whatsoever in terms of, you know, the how
But you don't
much they
even know
will.
that. You don't know that.
You're right, I don't. But let's assume that creating news stories by pretending what would have happened if Philip K. Dick had written Lord of the Rings. And yes, I have tried some things along those lines. Okay, so I've had some fun with that. And I've done silly experiments with Dickens as well, and so on. So, but anyhow, but that's just stuff. Whatever it is, though, play with it, have fun with it. One of the worst things you can do is just have this grim determination of I must do X, Y, or Z. And, play is a great way to learn about things. And I mentioned Vygotsky earlier, and that was one of the great realizations of Vygotsky, just how incredibly powerful play can be as a learning content or experience. And it's a great time to jump into the water. So, I'd encourage people to, just enjoy it, have some fun with it.
Yes.
And that's what I'm trying to do with talking with machines.
What's going down? Stop me. What's that sound? Everybody